Great. One more time, welcome everybody to this session, The Power of Questions, how to make great decisions in meetings. We see a lot of interest in this topic. So apparently I'm not the only one who is sometimes frustrated by meetings. Before I get into it, I'll briefly introduce myself so that you know who's talking to you. I'll keep it very short. I was born in Amersfoort, the Netherlands, just like the painter Piet Mondriaan. I have a background in philosophy from King's College London and a background in management from RSM. I did my PhD here, finished that about 10 years ago, and still lecture here, mostly in executive education. And this dual background in philosophy and management, you can also see that in my teaching. So I teach on decision-making, thinking skills like critical thinking and creative thinking, and happiness. And for all these topics, it's really at the interface of philosophy and psychology. Here you can see me in action, pondering a deep philosophical question. Now, I say that somewhat jokingly because many people have this sense of philosophy as being irrelevant for practice. And I think that's 90% true, but I see it as my mission to take that remaining 10% and bring it to practice. If you want to reach out to me afterwards, here's my email address. Again, we'll share the slides with you. And finally, I don't stand on formality. So I am a doctor, but you don't have to call me Dr. Eskenazi. You can just call me Dr. Phil. Many people do. At the beginning, I wasn't so happy about that, but I've learned to live with it. Okay, so why are we here? And I don't mean that in the deep philosophical sense, but in the very practical sense, why are we in this masterclass? I want to start with a promise. Give someone a fish and you feed them for a day. Teach them how to fish and you feed them for a lifetime. Show them to the supermarket and they don't have to eat fish every day. That's a Dr. Phil original. And what I mean with that is decision-making is the ultimate meta skill. Whatever problem you have in your life, if you can make a good decision about it, that's going to help a lot, right? So if you can master this skill of decision-making, you're going to see the benefits in all areas of your life and they're going to accumulate. So that's my promise to you. I'm going to show you to the supermarket. And I'll do so in 3 acts, 3 parts. The first act is the challenge. Talking about why we actually need to even think about decision-making. And here I'd like to start with a poll. So Eden, if you could launch the first poll, please. I see a lot of answers coming in. That's wonderful. So most of you have answered. I still see some answers coming in. But maybe Eden, you can also share the results. So what I see here is that the majority, 58% chose average, and then 30% somewhat above average. And then there's a few people who said somewhat below average and some even far above average. And this is a fairly typical pattern when we ask this question. Many people think they're average or just above average, and very few people think of themselves as below average. It's a bit as like with driving. If you ask people if they're an above average driver, most people think they are, and nobody thinks they are below average. And this is actually an important issue in decision-making because we are often blind to the fact that we have a lot of room for improvement. Now, I'll get into that a little bit more. And I want to start with asking ourselves, what do we mean with good decisions? So if we're talking about the quality of our decisions, what are we actually talking about? So maybe you can think of an example of a good decision can be made by somebody famous like Steve Jobs or Winston Churchill, or a decision that you made yourself. Just see what's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of a good decision. So I ask this question often to executives, and mostly the examples people come up with are decisions with great outcomes, right? If you like the results, then you'll say that was a good decision. And that's a very natural way of thinking about good decisions, but it's also possible to think differently. So I want to propose a shift in perspective on the quality of decisions. because in business decisions, there is always uncertainty present. So if you look at outcomes, you're looking at the quality of your decision plus this luck factor that can be good luck or bad luck, right? Instead, if we evaluate decisions based on the information we have available at the time of making the decision, you get a different picture. And this has two benefits. First, it allows us to separate the quality of the decision from that luck factor. And second, more importantly, it allows us to correct rather than regret. Because the benefit of hindsight is that you know the outcome of the decision. The downside of hindsight is that it's too late to do anything about it, right? If instead we can evaluate our decisions before we commit to them, we have a chance to improve them if that's necessary. So this raises two questions. First, how can we actually do that? How can we evaluate and manage the quality of decisions in the moment before we commit to them? And secondly, by this definition, how good are we at decision making? Now, we'll spend most of this masterclass on that first question, but first I want to look at the second one. How good are we at decision making? Maybe some of you have heard of Daniel Kahneman or even read this book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Kahneman passed away earlier this year. He won a Nobel Prize for his research. I'll try to boil it down for you in 2 minutes. And I'll do so through the lens of neuroscience. So when you look at the brain, one kind of interesting thing you can see is the different stages of evolution are represented there. So it's not the case that the brain kept evolving as a whole. It's that new stuff was built on top of old stuff, but the old stuff is still there. So we all have what is called the reptilian brain. This is our brainstem and some surrounding areas. And this regulates our heartbeat and our breathing, these basic physiological survival things. And this part of the brain is really very similar to the brains of reptiles and even the dinosaurs that used to roam the earth. Then on top of that, we have a cortex. And on top of the cortex, we have a neocortex. And different species of animals have different levels of this. So for example, birds have a cortex, but not a neocortex. Mammals have a neocortex. Some of them have a bigger one, some of them a smaller one. Monkeys have the biggest, and humans have an even bigger one. Now, I drew the human brain here as a separate layer, but anatomically speaking, it's part of the neocortex. And the bad news here is that these old brain structures, they're not like archaeological monuments, right? These are active parts of your brain. And the human brain is just a small part of it, and it's not the one running the show. Usually the monkey brain is in charge of your decisions. Kahneman doesn't call it human brain or monkey brain. He calls it system 1 and system 2, but it comes down to the same. So system 1, your monkey brain, is fast, associative, emotional, effortless, and automatic. And system 2, your human brain, is slow, sequential, logical, effortful, and deliberative. And usually the monkey brain is in charge of our decisions. And even when we do engage our system 2, our human brain, it doesn't always have the tools to make a good decision. So how bad are we then at decision making? Well, not that bad actually, because after all, monkeys are highly intelligent and resourceful creatures, right? However, when it comes to business decisions, you want to maximize value. And good enough in a competitive landscape is not good enough. And the monkey brain does tend to settle for good enough. Also, decisions can often be improved with relatively small investments. Often it's just a matter of taking a few hours or even just a few minutes of engaging your system 2, your human brain, and doing some reasoning, and you can substantially improve your decisions. So the return on investment can really be incredible here. So when you take this all together, what we see is that companies often leave lots of value on the table when it comes to decision making. I put a few references on the slide here to different books, but in addition, there's also 1,000 academic articles that paint a similar picture. So we're not terrible at decision making, we're pretty good, but there is lots of room for improvement. Now, I want to give you a sense for what that looks like in practice. So I'll quickly go through the big 5 decision traps. These are the main pitfalls we see in organizational decision making. The first one is the illusion of decision quality. So most people are overconfident about the quality of their decision. They think they do better than they actually do. And this is a bit difficult to see about yourself, but if you think about the people around you in the organization, perhaps you can think of someone who overestimates the quality of their decision making. And the problem with that is that it stops us from trying to do better, right? The second one is narrow framing. Often when we're faced with a problem, we jump right into solutions instead of reflecting on the problem. So we end up with an unconscious and very narrow framing of the problem. Thirdly, the agreement trap. This is when you're in a meeting and at some point there's a proposal on the table and everybody sort of nods and we all agree and we think we've made a high quality decision. Whereas in reality, that agreement often just signals some kind of social pressure rather than the quality of your decision. Number 4 is the comfort zone trap. This is solving the problem you know how to solve rather than the problem that actually needs to be solved. And finally, indecisiveness. This is when a decision just doesn't get made and bounces around from one person to another and just drags on for months and months. So I'm curious to know whether you have come across these decision traps. So we have a poll for that. Have you encountered at least one of these in your work? See a lot of answers coming in. That's wonderful. Give you another moment to answer. And so Eden, if you can also share the results, that's great. So there's a clear tendency here, and 98% of people have encountered at least one of these, and 2% haven't, the lucky 2%. So this confirms my suspicion, right? This is a widely spread, or these are 5 widely spread issues in decision making. And yeah, so this stands in the way of high quality decisions. So it's clear that there's room for improvement, and that's good because we'll spend Act 2 of this masterclass on how to do better. So what I want to do is go through a number of aspects of decision making, and each time point out some common patterns of things that go wrong, and also how you can do better. And I'll do so in the form of powerful questions that you can ask. And we'll start with framing. So framing refers to how you formulate the problem, how you reflect on the problem that you're trying to solve. So here's a common opening move. A director will say, we need to do something about the supply chain issue. Jim, you had a good idea. And this is a terrible opening move. Why is that? Well, mistake number 1 here is to jump into discussing solutions without first agreeing on the problem, right? All the director says is the supply chain issue. And this has consequences. This will lead to misunderstandings about the problem. Different people in the meeting will have different views on what the supply chain issue is. And also, it ignores the root cause. When we don't explicitly address the framing, we have to rely on an implicit or often unconscious understanding of the problem. And that means we tend to have a very narrow understanding, and we ignore the root cause. So we're fighting symptoms rather than the disease. Mistake number 2 here is to introduce conformity pressure. When a director or anybody with status in the organization says, Jim, you had a good idea, just by using that word good, it already introduces some conformity pressure, and it will be difficult for people to criticize Jim's idea. And people are very sensitive to this kind of pressure. So even if as a director you don't have any intention of doing that and you welcome critical thinking, people will still feel inhibited to do so. Now, a good question to ask here is, how do you see the supply chain issue? What question are we trying to answer? So when you ask this question, you bring the framing to the surface, and you will often see that if you have a little conversation on this, that different people will have different views and that you need a little discussion before you are all on the same page. Now, once you've done that and once you have clarity on the problem you're trying to solve, you'll want to discuss some potential solutions. But those discussions tend to be wildly unstructured and chaotic. And this shows up in a number of different ways. So you might get bogged down on specifics and discussing the details of one option that really don't need to be decided in this meeting. Ideas get lost, right? Somebody makes a suggestion and just the conversation moves on and the idea gets lost in the ether. Sometimes ideas get shot down too fast. So again, somebody makes a suggestion, somebody else has an objection, and you drop the idea, even though perhaps there's ways to overcome that objection. Often people are afraid to share their ideas, and you'll be amazed how often you're sitting in a meeting trying to solve a problem, and there's somebody sitting at the table who has the perfect solution in their head, but they're just not speaking up. And that's because people are very afraid to sound stupid. And often, even good ideas sound stupid in our own heads. So people often don't share their ideas, and particularly their more original ideas. And finally, we tend to settle for good enough. So once we hit on a solution that will solve the problem, we stop the discussion and we just go with that decision. And we may miss out on options that would deliver even more value. So there's lots of ways in which you can have chaos in these discussions. But there's a very simple way to introduce some order into that chaos. So if you say, let's capture these ideas without evaluating them yet. How about a quick brainstorm? Let's shut down our critical voice for a moment and get creative. So the essence here is to separate the generation of ideas from the evaluation of ideas. And just that tiny bit of structure can make a huge difference. And it in fact addresses all 5 of these points. So if you take just a little bit of time to generate and capture ideas without evaluating them yet, you won't get bogged down on specifics because you capture the idea and then you move on to the next one. No ideas get lost because you capture all of them. No ideas get shot down because you're not yet evaluating them. People will feel safe to share ideas, and you won't settle for good enough because you'll keep going until you have a really long list of potential solutions. And then once you have that long list, you can take a few minutes to narrow it down to a short list of plausible solutions that you want to investigate further. So again, just by separating the generation of ideas from their evaluation, you can have a huge improvement. Now, when I say separate, I don't mean you need separate meetings for that. It just means you can't do them at the same time, but you can do 5 minutes of brainstorming and then 5 minutes of evaluation back to back, right? And really 5 minutes can be all you need. You'll be amazed at how many ideas you can generate in just 5 minutes. The second issue to discuss here is binary decision making. And so this happens when we have a proposal on the table and we give it a yes or no answer, a go or no go. And we also may miss out on alternatives that are even better than the one we're considering. So a good question to ask here is, that sounds like a viable option. What other options might we consider? Right? That breaks open that binary frame and helps you consider even better options. All right, time for another quick poll. Is it better to base your decisions on facts or assumptions? Even if you could launch it, thank you. So again, I see your answers coming in. That's great. I'll give you another moment to answer. Okay, so most of you have answered, even if you can share the results again. There is a clear majority here. 91% of you say it's better to base your decisions on facts rather than assumptions. And maybe that's true, but unfortunately, we often don't have enough facts to do that. Our decisions deal with the future, right? And the future is unknowable. We have very few facts about the future. So we really have no choice but to make assumptions. And so we better make sure we do it in a good way. So making assumptions requires critical thinking because assumptions are dangerous. I think the result of the poll illustrates this. You would love to base your decisions on facts because facts are safe and assumptions are dangerous. So we need to take care when we deal with them. But as I said, we can't avoid it. To make decisions, we need to make assumptions. Decisions deal with the future, and there's just very few facts about the future. So we can't escape that. And the problem there is that assumptions often pretend to be facts, right? So we need to have our critical thinking ready for this. And the monkey brain, or system 1, is not very good at critical thinking. So a good question to ask here is, what assumption are we making? Why might we be wrong about this? Why might the opposite be true? So that first question, what assumptions are we making, brings awareness to the fact that you are in fact making assumptions, right? So this brings it to the attention of your monkey brain that you have to be careful here. And then those 2 follow-up questions, they're very powerful because they can help your monkey brain support you in your critical thinking. So the monkey brain system 1 is not very good at asking these questions. It's not very good at engaging in critical thinking, but it's very good at answering these questions. If you ask it, why might the opposite be true? That's a question that your system 1, your monkey brain, is very well able to answer. So these questions are very powerful because they enlist the help of your monkey brain in critical thinking. The other thing you want to accomplish here is probabilistic thinking. Again, because the future is unknowable, it makes much more sense to think in the future in terms of scenarios with some probability attached rather than a single scenario that you know with certainty. But the monkey brain doesn't like that. The monkey brain tries to avoid uncertainty. So a good question to ask here is, what is the likelihood that this will happen? What percentage would you put on that? Again, it brings awareness to the fact that you are making assumptions about the future, and it naturally brings you into the mindset of thinking in terms of probabilities. The next aspect of decision-making I'd like to discuss is defining outcomes. And here I'll start with a quote. The first step in getting the things you want out of life is this: decide what you want. And very often we skip this step. So you see people arguing over alternatives. I think we should go for A. No, B is clearly better. Have you actually defined what you mean with better? Very often we skip this step and we leave it implicit what it is we care about. So a good question to ask here is, what are we hoping to get out of this decision? What outcomes do we care about? And when you raise this question, you'll see that often people have different views on this, or maybe there's things they haven't thought about. So one person might care about customer satisfaction, another person might care about short-term cash flow, and perhaps there's an implicit conflict there that you haven't thought about. And so asking these questions helps bring that to the surface and helps you define what you care about, and if necessary, helps you come to a compromise on that. When you do so, you also want to define trade-offs. So here a good question to ask is, how much of A are we willing to give up for more B? How much are we willing to pay for a 10% increase in customer satisfaction? So again, we might agree that customer satisfaction is a good thing. We might also agree that paying for things is painful. But how do you trade off these two? How much are you willing to pay for that increase in customer satisfaction? Again, you might discover that you have different views on this and you have to come to a compromise. When you do that, when you discuss these trade-offs, don't trust your monkey brain with the risk versus return trade-off. We very often have to make that trade-off between risk and return, and the monkey brain is just very bad at that. It's just bad at dealing with risk and uncertainty. There's a lot more I could say about that. Today, I don't want to go into net present value or discount rates or anything like that. I just want to highlight one thing, and that's loss avoidance. This is a feature of human psychology where we don't like taking even a chance of losing money, even if the potential gains are worth it, right? So sometimes we can make an investment that costs some money now, but has a high upside, but just that risk of losing money makes us very uncomfortable, and we tend to want to avoid that. So a good question to ask here is that a risk worth taking? Right? It again brings attention to, it acknowledges that there is a chance that you will lose money, but it asks explicitly, is it maybe good to take that risk? Is the upside worth the downside? Now I have a confession to make. I have secretly been teaching you the decision quality framework. I'll say more about that framework in a moment, but I just want to take here a moment to show you how these different elements hang together and lead to a complete decision. So the starting point is, what is a decision? A decision is ultimately a choice between a number of alternatives, right? You're going to have a number of options on the table, and you'll have to choose one of those options. That's what a decision is. You want to choose the alternative, the option that gives you the most of what you want. We just discussed defining what you care about, what you want to get out of a decision. So you want to choose the option that gives you the most of that, right? And how you do that, that evaluation is based on information and on assumptions. We also discussed those. But how do you actually do that? How do you come to make that evaluation of your list of options, your list of alternatives? Well, there's many tools you can use here. For example, you can use your gut feeling, just going with whatever option feels the most attractive. That can be a valid approach. You can use the back of the envelope method, just doing some pros and cons. You can use net present value models, discounted cash flow models, that sort of thing. Decision trees, advanced methods like Monte Carlo simulation or real options valuation. These are all tools that you can have in your toolbox for reasoning and modeling your decisions so that you can come to make that evaluation. What I want to give you here as an insight is that you want to make that choice consciously, right? So a good question to ask here is, how can we evaluate our alternatives? How can we estimate to what extent they meet our goals? So what tool are we going to use for that decision? And you want to base that choice on two factors. So a good follow-up question is, how important and how complex is this decision? So if a decision is very important and also complex, you probably want to use a fairly advanced method, right? If it's not so important or it's quite obvious what you should do, then you don't really need any fancy tools for that. But so these are two factors you can take into account when choosing the tool for this job. How important and how complex is the decision? Again, I'll say more about the framework in a moment. There is one more element to that framework, and that is committing to action. This is where once you've made that beautiful decision, you want to make sure that it gets implemented, right? And there's two mistakes I want to highlight, two things that often go wrong. The first one is to make a decision without involving the implementers. So you're sitting in your meeting, you've made a decision, and the people who actually have to implement that are not in the meeting. So they don't know why you made this decision. They don't know the context. They don't know the intention behind it. They might not have sufficient buy-in, right? So if you just drop it on their desk, or if you just send them an email, hey, please do this, that's a good recipe for a failure in the implementation. So a good question to ask is, whose buy-in do we need to make this a success? And what is their perspective on the matter? And that doesn't mean they have to be in every meeting. It doesn't mean they have to agree, but at least they have to have sufficient buy-in and understanding of the reasoning behind the decision to be committed to making it a success. The second mistake I want to highlight is remaining stuck in decision mode. And this is when a decision just doesn't get made and it just keeps bouncing around the organization, sometimes for months, and everybody's wondering what's going to happen, but nobody is making a decision. And I want to contrast decision mode here with action mode. So these are two different psychological modes, and they operate very differently. So when you're in decision mode, you want to question everything. You want to doubt everything. You want to have a critical attitude and an open mind, right? That's very helpful when you are making decisions, but it's not so helpful in implementing them. So when you're in action mode, you're in a very different mindset. In action mode, you're not questioning, you're not doubting, you don't have that critical attitude so much because you're completely focused on doing a good job implementing the decision. And so that's a very different mental mode. So a good question to ask here is it worth thinking about this some more, or shall we cut the knot now and switch to action mode? Now, I'm curious to know which issue bothers you more. Is it the indecisiveness side of the scale, or is it making decisions without sufficient analysis? Again, I see the answers coming in quickly. I'll give you another moment to answer. Great. And Eden, if you could share the results. It's a very close contest between indecisiveness and deciding without enough analysis. And in fact, also there's a lot of people who find that both happen too often. And again, we have a lucky 2% who don't seem to have this issue. I see. So again, it's quite close between indecisiveness and deciding too quickly. And yeah, so both of these issues seem familiar to you. With that, we come to the end of Act 2 and we move into the final act, Act 3, integrating the answer. Now, I've been talking a lot, I'm aware of that. And normally when I teach on campus, we do that in much smaller groups, usually 15 to 20 people, and we make it very interactive, right? That's a bit more difficult to do in a webinar with so many participants. But still, I hope you got some useful insights in Act 2. In this final act, I want to help you integrate those insights so that the next time you're in a meeting and you're making decisions, you can actually apply them. So that's what we'll spend this final part on. And so to do that, I will tell you a little bit more about the framework. So I already confessed to you that I've been using the decision quality framework, and I want to just give you the core idea behind this. The core idea is that every decision consists of the same 6 elements. So whether it's about what to have for lunch, or who to marry, or whether to acquire that competitor, all decisions have the same 6 elements. And so if you make sure these 6 elements are of high quality, then you have a high quality decision. And this is very useful for your system 2, for your human brain, because it basically gives you a language, it gives you the concepts to think about decisions. And system 2 depends on concepts and language for its reasoning. So this is a very helpful tool for your system 2, your human brain. So what does it look like? Well, I already went through these 6 elements in Act 2, but here they are once more. Number 1 is framing. So this is about what's the problem you're trying to solve and how do you formulate that? Number 2 is about creative solutions. So, right? So in the end, a decision means you're choosing one alternative from a list of options you have on the table. And so you want to make sure you have some good options in that set. Number 3 is information and assumptions. Number 4 is defining outcomes, defining what it is you care about and you want to get out of this decision. And in element number 5, these things come together. So for each alternative on your list, you're going to use information and assumptions to see to what extent they meet your outcomes. So you can choose the one that gives you the most of what you want. And then element number 6 is committing to action. Now that you've made this beautiful decision, making sure that it also gets implemented successfully. And you can think of these as a checklist. So again, if all 6 of these elements are of high quality, that means you have a high quality decision. Conversely, if one of them is missing, you have a weak decision. A decision is only as strong as its weakest link. Because if you have a great answer to the wrong question, or you have great reasoning based on false information, or you have a great decision that doesn't get implemented, you have nothing, right? So if even one of these links is weak, your whole decision is weak. And that's why it's so important to engage your system 2, your human brain, because the monkey brain is unlikely to think of all 6 of these elements. I want to give you a quick impression of how decision-making can actually create value for your organization. So what I mean with that is by investing in the process of decision-making, by increasing the quality of your decisions, how does that translate into financial value for the organization? And I'll give you 2 quick examples. So first, through better framing and creative thinking, you might find a new solution that you wouldn't otherwise have considered that is much more valuable, right? Or through better assumption checking and modeling, you come to select a choice that you wouldn't otherwise have chosen that unexpectedly came out as the most valuable. So these are two simple examples of how an improved process of decision-making can translate directly into financial value. Now, an interesting observation that we can see in practice a lot is that we tend to overthink small decisions and underthink big decisions. We don't sufficiently adjust our process for the importance of the decision. And for small decisions, that means that we waste time on them, but especially we waste mental energy on them because decisions take up a lot of mental space. For big decisions, the impact can be quite big, right? So what does that look like? What does the return on investment for decision-making look like? Well, it's really not uncommon to end up with decisions that generate twice as much value. And to have an improvement of 10 or 20% is very, very common, right? On the other side of the equation, the investment is often very modest. So you can often accomplish this with just a few hours of analysis or even just a few minutes of system 2 thinking time. Depending on the importance of the decision, you may want to spend a lot more time, right? So if there's tens of millions at stake, you probably want to spend a few weeks, but then also the benefits increase proportionally, right? So I'll leave it to you to do the math here on the return on investment in this stuff. Now, I want you to have a look at the man in this picture. This man is in a Microsoft Teams meeting with his colleagues. They're making a decision, and look how happy he is. This is also what I want for you. So the dream is to move from arguing over alternatives to reasoning together. And how can we accomplish that? By building shared mental models. And I want to take a moment to unpack that for you. So what we can accomplish with a framework like this is to isolate our differences. So why do you want A and I want B? Why do you want to go left and I want to go right? Where does that difference in conclusions come from? Is it because we have a different view of the situation, right? Maybe we just have to spend some time framing the problem together. Or perhaps we have different assumptions or different information, right? Maybe we disagree on some empirical questions. Well, these questions often can be resolved. Maybe we have different desired outcomes, right? We might differ on questions of value, and that might mean that we have to come to a compromise. It's very useful to isolate your differences in this way. And a framework can be tremendous help in doing that. The other aspect here is finding creative solutions together. This is also something in which we can improve a lot. And if there's one thing I want you to take away from this masterclass is that tiny bit of structure can go a very long way to turn idea generation from a chaotic process to a productive and even a fun process. And just to reiterate that tiny bit of structure is to separate the generation of ideas from their evaluation. So just to take a little bit of time to generate and capture ideas without evaluating them yet. I also want to point out, it just takes one person to accomplish this. So it's not the case that everybody in the meeting has to buy into the decision quality framework or anything like that. If there's one person in the meeting who has these skills to facilitate decisions, it can go a very long way in achieving that dream of reasoning together. Because the concepts we discussed today, they're not rocket science, right? They're not higher mathematics. They're all kind of commonsensical. They're common sense, but not common practice. So it's not so hard to convince people that these are good questions to ask and also worth answering. So if you have one person in the meeting who has those facilitation skills and who has that awareness to bring a framework or at least a structure that system 2 can work with into the conversation, it can go a very long way in accomplishing that dream of reasoning together. Now, there's a lot more I could say about this topic, and in fact, I will say a lot more, but not today. So if you want to go deeper into this, you can join my program. It's called Decision Power, Clear Thinking for Better Decision Making. It's a 2-day program on campus in Rotterdam. The next run is in November, And if that one is full, you can contact Erica for future runs. We already have a few more planned for next year. In this program, we will go through the whole framework and you will learn to master every element of it. We also look at some advanced topics, and you get to bring a real life decision case into the classroom, and you receive coaching on that, both during those 2 days and also after the program. So we have a link here to the brochure. We'll also make that available to you, I think tomorrow, in an email that will go out. So if you're interested in this, I'd love to see you there. It's a lot of fun, and we can go a lot deeper, of course, in those 2 days than we can do in this webinar. I also included a cheat sheet in this presentation. I won't go through it, but I just want to point it out to you. This sheet contains all the questions we discussed, organized per element of the framework. So you can find those in the slides when we send them out, and hopefully it's going to help you in your next meeting. With that, we come to the end of my presentation. I want to thank you very much for your attention. If you want to reach out, my email address is here on the slide, but also we have plenty of time now for any questions you want to ask.